Hello, everyone. I want to thank you for attending. I hope you've been enjoying today's presentations. I'm really excited to share a student perspective on how 2020 has opened a new dialogue on race and diversity and inclusion in higher education. So this presentation will look into how to build inclusive spaces more proactively and cognizantly, as well as achieving the best education by eliminating obstacles and especially through genuine open dialogue through diverse students. I'm going to get started. So how 2020 is, I will explore specifically observed challenges to inclusion specific to prior to 2020, as well as the changes reflected after. However, I wanted to leave on a positive note too by discussing opportunities to overcome common obstacles, as well as inclusion in higher education and the potential this holds in the future as well. Sorry about that previous. All right, so a little bit about myself, just to share some context so that you have a little bit of insight about my point of view. So I'm a queer woman of color. I'm in a long-term interracial relationship. I was adopted by parents who genuinely appreciated different cultures. They lived in the Western Highlands of Guatemala with the mom. They lived in the Navajo Reservation in Arizona. So with that, and I was also raised in New Mexico within a Hispanic community too. So many of which were first and second generation, and I absolutely adored it. And choosing to move to New York, to pursue my passion for advertising and marketing. It was a bit of a culture shock moving from the wide open desert, and away from insanely spicy foods. But it was also an amazing opportunity to expand my worldview even further. So I truly appreciated that. So overall, I'm looking to share my views. These views are specifically my own and my own experience. They're meant to inspire further consideration. What I hope you take away from this presentation are hopefully new points of view, a desire to start conversations about diversity, and a motivation to get strides towards greater inclusion. That said, I really want to encourage you to share your experiences and thoughts in the chat as I speak, especially if the topic really resonates with you. This way we can all learn from each other as we go. Everyone has so much to offer. So let's begin with the inequalities observed prior to COVID in 2020. While I've observed many inequalities due to constraints such as time, I'll focus on the topics that were highlighted and exacerbated by the events of 2020 as well. So I found there are additional hurdles within the higher education community, and one such hurdle was assumed assumptions. It's human to assume that we share similar experiences in life, at least on some level. It takes actively really observing to recognize the subtle differences, the same way when we're children, we all assume that we like the same foods and like to play with the same things until we speak with other children and really get to know that. So it impacts the material, as well as excluding minorities. It does perpetuate not belonging. It doesn't have to be and is often not very overt or recognized when it is practiced. So even while applying to colleges and taking placement exams when transferring colleges, I noticed the effects of this assumption bias. For example, when I was taking the ACT during the reading comprehension portion, there was a significantly long paragraph about boating and sailing, and seems innocent enough, right? As someone who grew up in a landlocked state, I was truly at a loss. I didn't understand what the paragraph was saying. I didn't understand the questions. And there were enough boating related terms that I really had to guess at my answer. And I had the most experience even seeing boats from various road trips I'd taken than my classmates. So I could only assume how much everyone else was struggling with me. So with that, just kind of taking a look at the SAT and ACT example, they also have another difficult dynamic to them. And I know it's something that we've kind of with COVID, there have been quite a few changes in needing those tests to get in, but it does also help level the playing field a little bit for those whose grades were not necessarily a good representation of who they are as a student. Sometimes grades are given unfairly or out of bias. I've experienced that. There's definitely at times a push for, maybe someone doesn't see that student as belonging at that school or institution, or even just a bias against them. With that, there's also life burdens and responsibilities that might have made great grades impossible. So whatever the reasoning, it might cause them to be edged out. And so due to those grades regardless, on the other hand, I also saw that those with private educations, it was something where they had their curriculum taught to the tests, or those in public education could afford it and paying for tutors and other resources. So I wanted to point this out as an example, so, as it's very complex, and these issues can be very dynamic. Uh, Going back to my experience as well, as I've continued with college, I found that the teaching style and test examples and even homework compositions varied based on the professor. And they might have been experts in their field, of course, in most cases they very much were, but the professors were also molded by their own lens and personal view of the world, just like I am by mine. So sometimes it was based on how they thought it would be best to help their students, which was helpful sometimes, but sometimes misdirected. I've seen in a group the bias in that sense in trying to have multiple students anticipate the presentation and the assignment, what the teacher wants and is expecting. So they alter it because it's so different than what the students know, and just in interacting with them, they recognize that. So then that moves the focus out of learning to appeasing, and in order to not fail, which honestly leads into our next topic here. So assumed collective thoughts and experiences. They, especially on an interpersonal level, many universities require some form of interpersonal communication for the admission process, and this can become tricky. There's an inclination to think through the different views and affinities and just familiarity. It's totally natural to gravitate that towards that which you're familiar with. But it can also, well, viewed as logical, can also be a little bit hard when someone comes across as too radically different from what they know, and it can be sometimes uncomfortable or even off-putting. Personally, I found it helpful in certain circumstances to highlight my diverse point of view while appearing non-threatening, if possible, and which can be unfair at times or not conducive to what's happening. And it doesn't necessarily highlight the true diversity that I can bring. So with that, these differences may be apparent in different ways too. Take professional appearance. That's something that it's meant to indicate your respect for the institution and their time and the person that you're meeting. Yet I've seen different examples of professionalism and professional attire when it comes to the clothing and the background of the person who is attending. So where those variations apply, it may not be a sign of disrespect, but it may be taken that way. With so many different aspects of our personalities and communication styles and appearances, they can be mistakenly interpreted to hold additional meaning, and often significant meaning that can really determine whether the person is accepted into that space, which is really harmful and detrimental when it comes to inclusion and diversity. Uh, that said, with two different applicants and they have that differentiation, there is the tendency towards the familiarity. So I think it's helpful to reflect on that too as we enter new situations and encounter people that we might not have as much in common with. So the lack of influence on the dialogue when diversity is discussed, it's often one-sided as a narrative. The point of view from the outlook of, say, the person writing the book or making the material, leading the discussion, it maybe doesn't hold a lot of variety with that. So when we're brought into the discussion, if you are someone with some diversity in the situation, it's more, please give us a look for the fill in the blank minority point of view. And this can be a very limited take and often frustrating. I've heard it said before, I'm not the Rosetta Stone for said point of view. So with that, it also does come with having to disclose details about yourself and having your life dissected and questioned by a group of people, possibly, and ultimately further differentiating yourself from the class and instructor, which might harm you in the long run in being able to, connect and assimilate better in the future. So how does this all look in the lens of COVID and BLM? So with the changes of 2020, I really do consider this an emotional reckoning of sorts. There are so many systems that work against diversity, people of color, and it's something where BLM did bring about an open communication and dialogue about those systems, because oftentimes those systems are used as an acceptable way to air prejudice, right? So I think that there was some positivity brought about with that, but there were the disparity in the effects among the communities of color. We saw the additional impact of COVID really on these communities and how sometimes it doubled the fatalities, which is horrible, and the mortality rates. And with that, the way that they're interacted with the medical community, and you had doctors who were of color who weren't being treated, even from their point of view, adequately, and they have experience in the field. So it's something where you then have to really look at it, and it holds more of a magnifying glass and highlighting these disparities and the new educational format that was adapted as a way and safety precaution for the public, then also might have exacerbated some situations and highlighted others. So I'm going to jump right into that. So since COVID and BLM, you're looking at the openness and ability to speak. There's this American consciousness often, or societal outlook, if you were, that you need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, that if you try hard enough, you can stop or change or alter it. Everyone is biased by their perception. Popular ones say would be, if you are a large person, you're, big, strong, hard, tough, which means that you have to coin the term big teddy bear because you're well-rounded perhaps. So why do we have these terms as an indicators, and it's something where I think being able to talk about the fact that there are these biases and the systems I mentioned prior, it's difficult to bring up racial or social inequalities and without it really impacting your relationship with the person. It's reflected in the job market as well as with additional, situations, say with instructors. I think it becomes something where, I've heard it said, well, you just made it a race thing, or is this a race thing? Or, well, now I can't say anything because now it just makes me look bad. And I think that BLM really brought up the ability to be able to talk about it without it being viewed as stepping out of line, perhaps, which has definitely occurred at times for me, or at least that viewpoint. So that has been a definite positive change. And I think that having a consistent dialogue from here on out is a change that we should definitely be working towards. The next one is redefining safe. So when it comes to safe spaces, I remember coming out, I came out in high school and it was still new enough in my area that we had to have a safe space. And with our gay student union, or, gay student association, we had kind of a stopgap so to speak, where you had to go to the counselor and talk to them about your interest in maybe joining the club. And with that, they would give you the date and time and location. And that way it wasn't publicly, put so that any student can see, and it helped limit the amount of harm and uh, different, possibly physically questionable situations. There were definitely some harmful situations that were possible. So it limited the amount of prejudice and bigotry, but it definitely created a safe space because you knew everyone who was there wanted to be there and was open. And so it's something where I think that with Black Lives Matter and just everything that happened in 2020, it meant that we have the ability to redefine this. And I think that safe spaces were something where it was almost accepted. I believe where part of, why it became such a point of discussion or contention is that I think, and oftentimes we were accepting the fact that, well, yeah, racism's wrong. That's assumed. Everyone knows that. But did everyone know that? And was it, even if you knew that, were there biases and underlying premises that were really affecting people of color or communities, And it's something where I think having that available and open and seeing examples of where that wasn't the case and it made it a little easier to have these dialogues, it really brought about, okay, well, maybe there is a need for safe spaces now, like on a very inclusive level that before safe space in kind of the colloquial, everyday usage, I heard it more described for the gay community, the LGBTQ community, just due to the fact that personally, I think because it was a little more accepted to hate there or have a little more of a prejudice, just due to, personal reasonings. Whereas, like I said, the racism, it was a lot harder to have that point of view and still have it be socially acceptable. But I think that we need to definitely redefine and look at, okay, what are we doing to accommodate that? When you are teaching and you're very much an expert on your field, maybe a topic that you're addressing, one of the people in your class might actually be much more versed in it just due to life experiences, or it might be something that you wouldn't even have thought of or might not even occur in a traditional situation. So being open and receptive to learning and available to completely new viewpoints that might otherwise be inaccessible when it comes to, say, not being in a book or not, there are definitely points of, if you experience it, you have a very different outlook than, say, studying it. And it can definitely widen the discussion and open up the class on that scale. And then, just kind of thinking about, when was the last conversation you had in a class that made you uncomfortable, but it was a positive discussion? It might have, and the uncomfortable thing, different people have different thresholds of uncomfortable. So that's not a universal, but when was the last time that there was something where it was maybe hard or difficult to discuss, but in the end, it was a learning opportunity, and there, was the openness and the vulnerability there to do so, because you have to have a level of vulnerability to really have that work. With that being said, I think people of color or diverse students as a whole need to be the driving force for the dialogue as well. It's not the status quo right now, and putting your 2 cents in where you can, it's discouraging, and I think it does change what is said and feeling like what's available to be said. So if the education is led by the students, if teachers, genuinely ask where the students want to go long term and what they want to learn more about, I feel like that's something that has actually happened more and more with the current situation post 2020, where the majority of my teachers have actually come out and asked those questions, and who do we want to talk to, and maybe they can get a speaker in, and being very open to having the class dictate the dialogue, dictate the discussion, as well as the direction of the class, maybe in a long-term focus, as well as, of course, hitting all your objectives, because that is, of course, very crucial. But I think that it does really, impact the experiences, being able to share those experiences, and maybe changing the filters of your own experiences and being able to remove it a little bit more. And it can help pushing through to the root of the problems, and unless you're living it, sometimes it's hard to see what those problems may be. You can't really understand the extent of the underlying biases that stand in the way. So sometimes, having that student available to and feel comfortable enough to open up about it does very much make a difference, and starts a conversation where, there may be conflicting points of view on how to even address said issue, or how prominent is that issue, because it's not universal. We all have very different points of view, even within our own communities of diversity. There are very different points of view, but I think those conversations are necessary and crucial, and it's the best way that we can learn. So with safe spaces, the next portion of that is really looking at the digital frontier when it comes to safe spaces. So you have safe spaces in a new way. So with new platforms, it really brings the opportunity for a new level of acceptance, which is amazing. But with that whole racism is wrong approach, if you're not, confronted with it on a daily basis, you don't have the physical, I'd say, apprehension to say it to someone's face, because I think that it does lower the barrier. They're a bit more emboldened to tell others what they're truly thinking, and finding communities of others and feeling justified and feeling like they found, someone who really validates that point of view, and now they need to tell the world. And I think that that's something where that personally, I think that's where we came to when it comes to some of the craziness that happened in the beginning of 2021. I think some of that stemmed from having support for some of those views. And I think that having the support and having, that emboldenment makes it hard when it comes to now we're all in this digital era, this digital age, and we're on so many platforms, and we're now doing various posts, and it gives a false sense of security to be maybe more offensive. And I have seen situations with that too, where they might not have said that. It also, it blurs the boundaries. It might not even be that overt, really, that's a very extreme example. But I have seen certain situations where we're all at home, maybe the people you're talking to are all wearing pajama pants. So with that, if there is that blurred boundary and you're feeling that much more relaxed, maybe you might say something that you might be less likely to when you're fully dressed, ready to go, sitting in a classroom, much more in a formal setting. And I think with that ability to be more comfortable, I think it brings about the opportunity to have more dialogue and discussion about said situations, but I think it can also be hurtful at times too. And when you look at, say, breakout groups, often they're not mediated. It's something where it's the opportunity to speak with other students, but if they're not mediated and the other student doesn't have the best intentions at heart, or might not like the student they're talking to, is there anyone there to kind of intercept? How does that work? Especially if there's a breakout group with work that is assigned in the breakout group and it doesn't get completed. Now, are the students getting punished for the fact that there isn't that same camaraderie or the openness or acceptance there? it does make it very difficult. That we're now encountering issues that we really haven't encountered to the same degree, just due to the fact that we're working in a different way. Socially, with social media, with the posts, there's these expectations of professionalism. And I think it's something where we've started being a little more genuine and open to posting and being true to yourself. And I think I've seen it, said a lot, where it's nice to have a little more openness and genuine approach when it comes to maybe even the workplace or school or whatnot. But it has been noted too that there's inequality compared to counterparts when it comes to what's expected for that level of professionalism. That, you know, I've seen studies where compared to white male counterparts, say a woman of color, posting a picture in the exact same position, it might be seen as, not professional and actually a bit harmful and detrimental to their overall career or being able to get any kind of like reference in the future, something of that sort. So it's definitely something to consider too, where we're now having to address different issues in a different way. So overall tools for equity. Of course, we have logistics and being able to access tech, the lack of availability of campus services such as computer labs and PCs and internet speeds at comparable rates. There are certain students that always have their internet drop out where they're in and out of class 7 times, a session. And that's honestly the best internet connection they can obtain. So, is it something where the teacher then gets frustrated or they're seen even subconsciously seen as less engaged or less interested in the topic or invested? I know personally I've spent a few nights at the computer lab. When I say nights, I mean it was a 24-hour computer lab and I spent the entire night, and it was because I didn't have internet at my apartment and I had a project that I needed to finish and I didn't have a computer that was that good that could handle what was needed to be done for that assignment. And so I would just spend the night. I would work all night and then maybe see if I could find a couch in our lounge area and just nap, do a quick power nap for an hour and go to classes and have my full day. And was I at my peak performance compared to my counterparts? I'm sure I wasn't. I am sure I wasn't. But it felt necessary to get it done and still, work and have everything else in my life fall into place. And there is the disparity there. And I think there's also a lack of access to private spaces. And that being said, you have quite a few people where they might, share rooms with, especially you see it a lot in New York City, where they're sharing a small apartment with their full family. And so every time they turn on their mic to say a comment, there's always people in the background. So does that affect it? If there is a student that always has, music playing, a show playing in the background, people yelling, something going on like that, does it make it seem like they're more distracted and less invested? That said, it's hard to also concentrate in a situation like that, but maybe that's the best that they can do at that moment. And with that lack of, being able to be in a private space and being able to have meetings that, are very one-on-one and have that small talk and bonding. They've been, there have been reports of these meetings feeling rushed and impersonal, just on a general basis. So you can only imagine when there's not the same relatability there, how that really feels too. And enforcing the policies pre-COVID, now post-COVID, gets a lot harder when it comes to, okay, well, you need to get it from the bookstore. Well, does the bookstore have, okay, I was notified at this time, shipping, how does that work? Do I need to pay more for shipping? Students are now all over the country based on where maybe their families are. So how does that impact those who are around the corner and will get it tomorrow versus, they're states away or even different countries, now what? And with that, there's there's also a bit of an assumption that you're only a student most of the time, and that isn't always the case. So that gets very, very difficult to manage as well. So when you need to be at school and really focused, and they have these expectations, it's sometimes there are certain majors, and I've seen this in colleges I've attended, that you can't do that major if you're working. You just can't. They won't let you. And so how fair is that? And it definitely does exclude certain people. Not everyone can just go to school without working. And so now it's no longer about your passion or where you want to go or what you have to offer that field. It's very much, okay, what is your financial circumstance, and can you even manage that? So with having those additional responsibilities and those different limitations, I think it's something where we need to be aware of that with the equity situation. And so we need to move away too from the efficiency, one size fits all, equity-based situation, and asking about passions and topics related to education. Say, instead of how, like, this, with your experience in this situation, maybe leaving it even more open-ended, where if they've never experienced that situation, they don't feel excluded or like they can't input. Um, with that, sometimes they're very unexpected, but yet make a huge difference. I had a professor last semester who did an amazing job of, every time we logged in early, there was a carousel of resources for, food insecurity, for emotional well-being. Here are all the services, even for the census, because you felt like different students were underrepresented, and that, the right information needs to be out there, and how you do it, and, what's asked and what's not asked. And so all these things on top of being available and, on the slide every time we went to class, were also available on his, actual Blackboard page, so that you could log in on your own and just click the links and it took you straight there, which was amazing. I found that really insightful and open, and he made an amazing effort of trying to express that not every student feels like they have the security right now, and that you're not alone, and there are people and resources there to help you, and you can make it through. And it was really encouraging, and I found that really heartening, and I would love to see more of that as time goes on. Another thing he did is, every class he would do a poll about how we're feeling. How's the class doing? Okay, considering, or I'm not at all. And then he would just take kind of a temperature of the class, and based on how everyone was doing, it really did impact on whether or not we went into really hard topics. Sometimes he would push topics out based on the fact that, that day the class was just drowning. And that happens, especially with everything with COVID, and people had, relatives in and out of the hospital, or relatives passing, or, situations that were related, or job losses, or, you name it. When all these things are happening, I think it's very hard to focus on learning, even if you really, really wanted to. And so that said, I think it's really important to be cognizant of that, and then also be open and letting students know that that's not something to be ashamed of, that most people are very much struggling right now, and they're in a position where they're trying to do their best, and that is truly admirable. And there are resources, because they might not know that. And so I thought that was a very modern approach, and that's an example of a tool of equity that might not take additional resources. You don't have to get approval from higher ups to do, but it might make all the world a difference. And I think by having that constant, finger on the pulse of that class, that was probably one of my most engaged classes, where everyone was super open. We shared a lot, and it felt so close. It felt like a little community, and I really love that. So it definitely creates a new view on that. So that said, we're looking at a sense of belonging and new approaches. So with that, the connection, just because you're there doesn't mean you're included. And that's something too that you need to find an active way to be engaged with the class. I think that that statement alone really struck me the first time I heard it, because it's true. Just because you're present doesn't mean that, your point of view wants to be heard, that you really are made to feel included in the conversation. And it might not be conscious, it really just might be the overall structure of it. And so I think it's something where if you very openly and intentionally embrace the individuality of each student without necessarily putting them on the spot per se, but I think that the connection is really important and that all things are really interconnected. And even one action towards that impacts the whole. It definitely does change the dynamic of the classroom by accommodating that, say, one or two students, even if they are just one or two students. It does make the class that much better, and it brings new views and new openness. And in the whole part, the relationship of us working together is definitely greater than the sum of our parts individually. So I think that's something to definitely embrace. So the common themes here. So across all of these different categories, you're looking at the assumed shared experience. So basically that all of this same point of view is registered across the class or across the environment, the room, whatever situation, just unanimously. And walking in with that assumption does make it difficult to really be open and foster that sense. Unacknowledged value of the fact that it is necessary for equity in certain situations, that there's even inequality in certain situations, and that resources are available to make that inclusion possible. And then a lack of understanding about feeling heard or understood in the situation or even respected. And I think that that holds a lot of power. So how do we address these? I think that that's a very important question. So moving on to the action steps, firstly, I want to say an openness and willingness to learn. So I want to jump into that one first because you have to be willing to adjust your current thinking and accept others' experiences and knowledge. So it helps you uncover new insights and really get a new take on the subject, on what possibly might be hindering the students at the moment. And then the introspection to know that you do hold biases and that many of them are probably unconscious, but if you do discover them and you address them, it does impact the situation overall. And then with the active inclusion, moving beyond the percentages, how welcome are your diverse students? How much do they feel included in the dialogue? What can you do to further that? I think that that is amazing. Even just asking that question will usually prompt new ideas and spur new inspiration on the how, because the why is so important. And just by asking those questions. So, and promoting equity in the finding those tailored approaches. What works for your class? What's the subject? Maybe are there common complaints? Are there things that have been said online? The great part is with us all being online, we can use it as a more or less social listening tool, which is incredible. It gives, we don't have to be data or market researchers to be able to tell what people are thinking and what they're feeling on the subject. So I think it's definitely amazing to be able to avoid those missteps in avoiding the lack of equity in the classroom. But that said, don't be afraid of missteps. There is always a situation that occurs that just happens in life. Honestly, don't let it stop you. Don't let it hinder you. Apologize if necessary, but just take what you can from it and grow. And I think that that is the best possible thing, and it can be very daunting and scary, even doing new ideas and launching new programs, because there will be people, there will be, you know, some resistance on that. There usually is, because change doesn't come easily. And I think that our education system does really embrace that sense of having the right answer, knowing, you know, what's being said and going from there, and that it reinforces to not get things wrong, to not misstep. And so it's only natural to really want to maybe shy away from that possibility, but the commitment to being an ally and not being afraid of possibly doing that and being open really will make all the difference and really impact those you're around. And also let the students lead. Honestly, I think that that is fundamental, to check in consistently and see what they have to say on the subject and what insights on where they want to be, you know, and maybe things that are shortcomings that they've observed thus far, or even in other classes. I've seen professors say, what's something you've noticed in other classes that I could address in this class? And that has honestly spurred some amazing dialogue. So with that, just overall, on a higher note, you're talking about higher education and the influence that it has on the next generation, which is really amazing. It's something where you have a new model and potential for higher ed and the ability to impact the job market, and how higher education prepares us for the job market. Oftentimes, that's really one of the key reasons that many students go to college and seek higher education. So with that, you know, there is a symbiosis when it comes to industry and the job market as a whole. And so I'm recognizing that as a graduating senior. So what you're able to teach and impart and, you know, empower the students with, it will actually mold the generation, and it will move to a larger movement. You have the ability to really shape for the future, which is an incredible opportunity and power there. And then future leaders are definitely being made now. And it's moving these conversations to the workplace, which is really incredible. And the best part too is that with these conversations and as they move to the workplace, as we're forced to reassess norms with COVID and the structure of the education system from kindergarten to college, you are able to actually redefine how things work. You know, you may not have to do sabbaticals with visiting professors per se that are usually seen in the Ivies, where you can just virtually have teachers from all over the world now. There are so many opportunities when it comes to having speakers, international teachers, hearing from insiders from every industry, creating connections with your students and these professionals so that it has a lasting option and impact outside in the world as they go and continue their work experience. And it's also seeing that, you know, we're breaking down global barriers on that, and internet, like within our nation and internationally. And I think that there is so much potential with that as we move forward. So I feel very honored that I was invited to be here and speak with you today, and that this is a move in the right direction when it comes to dialogues that are created and led by people of color. I feel super honored that I could represent that. And I feel like definitely a move in the right direction. So I'm going to move on to the next section, which is our Q&A. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or in the Q&A section. Oh, thank you so much.
You have changed the way that we think today, and you already are doing amazing things. But when you get in the workforce, look out for whoever is lucky enough to hire you. So we wish you the very best, and thank you so much for this insightful presentation. I could listen to you for another hour. Everyone, if you like to close out the day with us. We've got one more event, and if you'll just head back to the agenda, we've got an afternoon tea and live conversation with Dr. Stetter, our board chair, Jeffrey Alderman, Dr. Steve Prescale, and Diana Hellerud. So, Brina, thank you again, and
Thank you so
good
much.
luck, and thanks.
Thank you. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm under my full name. There aren't many Brina Shooks. So also, if you want to email me too, if that's easier, I'm completely open to that. brinashook@gmail, pretty easy. So I'm definitely open if you have any further questions. If you want to bounce an idea off me, I would love to help out. Thank you so much.
Thank you.